Welcome to Dear Watchers, an omniversal comic book podcast where we do a deep dive into the multiverse.
We are traveling with you through the stories and the worlds that make up an omniverse of fictional realities we all love. And your watchers on this journey are me, Frank and Guido.
And me, Dracula Rob? That doesn't quite work.
No, Robcula?
Robcula?
That kind of works. I mean, it sounds like a fungus or something. But...
That's true. Well, before we get super scary, Guido, what's happening in our little section of the multiverse?
This is an very contemporary episode. Again, that's 2 episodes in a row that we've been incredibly contemporary. And, you know, I have to give credit for that to DC Comics. They're just so good that we keep wanting to cover them. It was an accident, but as I was looking at our last episode, I was like, wait a second, that was also a very current episode. This one might be the most current of all, and it's all because DC is just really batting 1,000, and we're enjoying it. So it's fun to talk about.
It is.
And... otherwise, I think go find us on Blue Sky. We're really enjoying that platform almost as much as we're enjoying DC Comics. So go follow us at Dear Watchers on Blue Sky. And it's holiday season while this is out. So if you have any gift lists or things that you think we should buy, make sure to post on Blue Sky about what you are gifting people from the comics worlds we've covered.
I think everyone's gifting Queer Mythology by Guido A. Sanchez this Christmas.
I hope so.
It's got pictures in it, so it's comics adjacent, as we've said before.
It's sequential art in some way.
Exactly.
Yes, it's true.
Well, if you are joining us for the first time, we have 3 parts of our journey through the multiverse today: origins of the story, exploring multiversity, and pondering possibility. So thanks for coming along.
And remember, leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening, and you can find all of our episodes at dearwatchers.com or wherever you podcast.
And with that, Dear Watchers, welcome to episode 148, and let's check out what's happening in the Omniverse with our travels to today's alternate universe. Today we go down to the lab to see what's on the slab and answer the question... what if classic horror movie monster tropes like Frankenstein, Wolfman, and Dracula were turned into a Nazi-fighting group of soldiers?
Yeah, this is a weird one. And our episode, there's not quite an alternate Earth. Usually this is the point where I tell you what Earth we're visiting. It's more of an origin story because there's a bunch of alternate Earths and some that were the prime Earths, but have since been rebooted. And it's a strange team with not too many appearances. So we'll talk more about exactly how we're covering them as we move through the segments. If you want more horror Earths, though, that we've covered, there are a lot. But we haven't quite covered this stuff before. We did cover Rocky Horror Picture Show when Deadpool was making references to Rocky Horror Picture Show, which was just in your little question there, a bit of a reference. But anyway, this is a weird series of alternate Earths. We'll have to decide what we think is canonical, what we think is not canonical, what should be canonical as we move through our segments.
And I'm just realizing we haven't said what we are focusing on. I guess it's a podcast. Everyone can tell from the title of the podcast. But it's the Creature Commandos.
Some people might listen they don't want spoilers.
That's true. They want to go in completely blind. Well, it is the Creature Commandos, soon to be also a TV show, longtime sporadic comic characters. So, Guido, what is your background with the Creature Commandos? And then I'll also throw in, what's your background with these kind of classic universal monsters in general?
I have no background with the Creature Commandos at all. I barely even knew they existed. I knew G.I. Robot. He seems more popular or just like persisted a bit more, or I just at least knew the design, who ultimately joins the Creature Commandos team. And I knew that this concept existed, especially because of one of the reboot versions that we are going to cover in our second segment. But I have never read them ever. I had no interest in them, which is funny because we're both interested in classic monsters. I am a big fan of the classic monsters, but that's not lifelong. I think when I was younger, I found them boring. which is weird because it wasn't just that they were black and white. I liked black and white movies. I liked Alfred Hitchcock movies and things like that. But for some reason, they never clicked for me very much until I started to watch them again and again as an adult and start to understand more about the creators and what they were doing. And so I love classic monsters. Bride is my favorite, of course, just because she is amazing. And we're going to talk about her introduction to this universe in our third segment today, because that is very exciting to me that they're finding a way to bring the Bride into this world. So that's my background on the Creature Commandos and the classic monsters that inspired them. What about you?
Well, I'll start with the classic monsters, and for them, I go way back. They must have been some of the very first movies I ever watched. I remember renting the original Dracula and the original Frankenstein from the video store, and I had to be like 3 or 4. So I don't know.
You were not 3 renting movies at the video store.
But I wasn't going to the video store myself renting the movies. It wasn't like I rode on my little bicycle over there to get them. But I would go with my mom.
3-year-old.
Well, and I think the cool thing with those Universal movies is our parents grew up with them also in like the second or third generation because they were playing on TV all the time.
Right,
in
being
the 50s
from the
or 60s.
1930s, yeah, no one grew up with them.
No.
I guess our grandparents' generation.
I guess our grandparents, but our parents were of like
Yeah.
that monster kid generation where they were playing on local TV. They would be re-released in the movies. There was the Monster Mash, all that. So I think my parents introduced me to those classic monsters. And the nice thing is, even though they're black and white and they might move at a different pace, they're also all like 65 minutes long, which we don't even realize today. So they're great for like a little kid who is that young because you can really just like watch them all in an afternoon. And I remember buying the Invisible Man and all these characters. But like you, I think I've actually grown in appreciation of them as I've gotten older and seen some of like the queer subtext that's in some of the movies and things like that. As for the Creature Commandos, I don't even know if I knew who they were. I think when I first heard the name, when the TV show was being announced, I kind of assumed they were all like lovable animals that were also now anthropomorphized. Like I thought it would be like, it's going to be a cat, but he's also like an army soldier. Like that's kind of what I thought in my head the Creature
like
Commandos
Grant
were.
Morrison's We Three.
I don't even know what that is, but sure.
I think you read that. I thought you
we?
read We Three, where it's like little cyborg pets become a army of soldiers.
Well, exactly. That is what I had in my head, that they were all going to be like different animals, but wearing like little military hats and stuff like that. I had no idea. Actually, I don't think it was until literally New York Comic-Con, like a month ago, that we went and there was a Creature Commandos thing because the TV show was coming out and we went through and you pointed out, it's like, oh, it's the Bride. And it's like, the Bride, I had no idea that they were classic monsters. Like, so I'm so new to this. It's been literally like 30 days. But
well, let's dig in. That's a good point.
Yeah, let's go back to the beginning. It's origins of the story.
Right now, on this very show, you're going to get the answer to all your questions. Our amazing story begins a few years ago.
And today's Weird War Tales begins appropriately enough in Weird War Tales number 93. This is from November 1980, and the story is called The Creature Commandos.
And of course, that's an anthology book that is also a tongue twister. So
it is.
This
Weird War
story,
Tales. Okay, I got it there.
Weird War Tales.
Yeah.
Weird War Tales. You can't even say it twice, I don't think, without messing it up. It's written by J.M. DeMatteis, penciled by Pat Broderick, inked by John Solardo, colored by Adrian Roy, lettered by Ben Oda, edited by Len Wein. J.M. DeMatteis was a contributor to DC's horror books like House of Mystery, all big in this Bronze Age era, Weird War Tales being of a piece with those books. DeMatteis later jumped to Marvel and did The Defenders and Captain America and Marvel Team Up, and was also a writer for the 1980s Twilight Zone TV show. Pat Broderick, the artist, worked on a number of titles across DC and Marvel, including Captain Marvel, Swamp Thing, JLA, Detective Comics, and co-created Tim Drake with Marv Wolfman. In this, so we really focused in on the origin story here, World War Tales number 93. I can't even say it once. But they have some installments occurring over the course of the next, I guess it's like 2 years and maybe 20 or fewer stories. And so we skimmed a whole bunch of them. And later in these weird war tales, Creature Commandos stories, Robert Kanigher takes over from DeMatteis. He co-created Sergeant Rock and Barry Allen Flash and was really famous for a run on Wonder Woman for a long time. And the art was taken over by Fred Carillo, who also did a lot of the DC horror and mystery titles, plus did some work on Masters of the Universe. So if someone hasn't read Weird War Tales and the origin of Creature Commandos, what do they need to know?
Okay, so we're in the World War II era. We're combating the Nazis, and Lieutenant Matthew Shrieve is working on Project M. What does M stand for? Of course, it stands for monster. So he has gotten a bunch of recruits. It's a little like Suicide Squad, of course, which I'm sure we'll talk about with James Gunn. A lot of people who were kind of against their will, they kind of are forced into this, and he's basically transforming these soldiers into monsters. So we've got Warren Griffith, who is kind of a podunk private there, who is being transformed into a werewolf, but he can't control when he turns into a werewolf, and of course he turns back into a human at inappropriate times. We've got Elliot Lucky Taylor, who stepped on a landmine, but they saved his body, and he's now like a Frankenstein monster character who can't speak. And we have the amazingly named Vincent Velcro, who was going to be
later they retcon his name to Velcro. I think they.
I know, but
also
Velcro
is a
cool
brand, so
my guess
probably that's why they add the second O. But anyway, go on.
Well, he was going to be put in the military gulag for assaulting a superior officer, so he gets injected with New Mexican vampire bat blood and is turned into basically a vampire. So he can be out in the sun, but he can turn into a bat, and he needs human blood to survive. So that's our like original team, and later they're joined by Jake, which is the robot you mentioned. So he's
GI robot.
So he's basically a robot dressed as a soldier, and he's got fancy guns and all that. And then our token female character, which is Dr. Myrna Rhodes, who transforms into like basically a Medusa character, but she doesn't turn people into stone. She's just got snake for hair. That's it. So she's like Dr. Medusa. And that's our core team with Lieutenant Shrieve kind of leading them. Yeah.
And so the setup in the origin, and then you just sort of follow them on their merry way through misadventures, is really neat, because what Shrieve says in this first issue is, we researched the subconscious archetypes, the symbols of fright and horror that all men seem to share regardless of social and cultural conditions, and then we set about scientifically recreating them, and that was the birth of Project M for Monster. So it's a cool idea, this idea of which we've seen in a lot of, I think, comic book World War II retellings and retcons, like how could supernatural or psychological warfare have been brought to like a comic book place? And I think this is a really fun way of doing that.
Mm-hmm. And I guess we have to almost put ourselves into the comic in that it's also the 1940s, right? Because some of these characters might not be so scary to an 80s audience, but from like a 40s audience, like these original movies that a lot of these characters would have like been popularized from would have only been 10 years old or less. So like I guess a 1940s audience in World War II would have been more frightened of like a Frankenstein monster than maybe like an 80s audience would have been.
Well, the movies I think are also less relevant here. If you think about horror archetypes, these are probably, if you're looking at Wolfman, Frankenstein, Dracula, these are like the three proto monsters in horror. Yeah. So I like that, again, what Shrieve is saying, like different cultures certainly have vampire stories or have Frankenstein/zombie-like stories and have like wolf animal person human stories. So yeah, I like how there are these broad archetypes. So it disconnects it from the movies. They certainly didn't license these properties from the movies or anything. There's no likeness. Obviously, they're being influenced, I'm sure, like you're saying, by the movies. But I like that it lives almost one level above that in their conception. Medusa, then, is a little random throw-in. I think they probably... I guess they couldn't do the bride because they didn't license the Universal Bride.
That look is very... yeah, I guess otherwise she would have just been like, oh, I guess a scary-looking woman if you couldn't do the bride hair, which is what we all know.
So I guess they had to
sense.
think like, okay, who is a proto-horror female? And Medusa from Greek myths is a pretty good one in terms of being a monster. There's also some references in some of the issues we read to Circe and some of the other like sort of witch prototypes, but none of them ever joined the team. So I guess Medusa makes sense. And then G.I. Robot is just a Weird War Tales mashup that really has no place being on the Creature Commandos, but sure, why not?
Well, he had his own stories in Weird War Tales as well, so I guess they figured, okay, like, let's just put these two
let's combine
characters
our
together. And there were so many things. It was making me think, too, like, actually, it was 7 years after this that the movie Monster Squad came out, which, of course, they're not battling Nazis in that, but it is like that basic idea of, like, let's put together all these classic monsters. And then even us growing up, there was, like, Transylvania High, I think, or it was called Horror High. Like, there was always this idea of, like, let's put all the monsters together and see, like, how they work
and
as
put them
a
in
team.
different settings.
Yeah, this must be one of the first, like, times that was done, though.
I don't know. The fighting war also had been done at this point. Like, so obviously, for those who aren't thinking about it, the name itself is clearly a riff on Nick Fury's Howling Commandos, who are all human, but just the name itself is there. But earlier than this, in Marvel Comics, Frankenstein is, like, fighting in World War II. They actually put Frankenstein in some of the Bronze Age horror as like a weird soldier. And then many years after this, they create Nick Fury's Howling Commandos as like a little spin-off, almost Elseworlds tale, where they become like werewolves than they are other creatures, clearly inspired by the Creature Commandos. But there's just a lot of, you're right, there's a lot of like mashups, but I don't think this is the original time that this kind of thing is being done.
Yeah, I guess you've got like Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein and all those things. Like, they were, as soon as they were all created, it was like, let's bring these characters together.
Yeah, and in comics, they're figuring out like what to do with these. Of course, the code has loosened in the 70s at this point to allow for the Bronze Age horror wave that was not allowed from the 50s onward. So I think that's why a lot of people are playing with these characters and trying to figure out what to do. And it's where we get the creation of some of the most famous horror comic book characters as well. So we skimmed their 18 or 19 stories in Weird War Tales. We did not absorb them all, but they go on and fight dinosaurs. They have some weird adventures, but they are always in 1940s. They are always in, other than when they're obviously fighting dinosaurs, but they are not brought to the present time at any point. Probably in part because the rules of this anthology book, I'm assuming, keep the stories placed in war times. So I guess that's why. But any overall impressions as we skimmed through their original appearances?
Well, you mentioned the loosening of the comics code, and I think one of the things that stood out to me here is just how violent and kind of disturbed some of these books are, especially when you probably compare it to superhero books that are coming out around the same time. My gosh, there are just people, innocent people, just being gunned down all the time. And of course, like, yes, some of the people that are being killed are Nazis, but not only them by vampires. So I think just a lot of that, and a lot of that comes through, I think, the really striking art of first Pat Broderick and later Frank Carillo,
which is very Bronze Age horror art.
There were some issues in there that were a little more plain and by other artists, and when those other artists did it, it lost a lot of the oomph when when you can tell it's these artists that are doing that super detailed, almost kind of Bernie Wrightson kind of Bronze Age horror look, it really like jumps off the page. Kind of, what did you think of like the art and also I guess the violent nature of these books?
I mean, I didn't notice the violence in the same way you did. I don't know why. I guess just because it's a war book, I sort of felt it was part and parcel. And then the art I loved, because I love this style of art. I love the 70s Bronze Age horror, heavy lines, lots of shadows. I like that look. But there's still bright colors. I mean, we read a digitally remastered edition of this, but even in its original format, there's bright comic booky colors with all these dark, heavy lines. So I like that style a lot.
Well, the one story that I think stood out to me the most was maybe like their fourth or fifth appearance. And what's happening is the Nazis are experimenting on children, and it's got kind of a Village of the Damned
it's called the
kind
Children's
of thing.
Crusade, by the way, which is very cool and a nice Avengers Wanda Maximoff reference.
Yeah, so they're experimenting on the kids. They're giving them superhuman strength. And right away, one of the kids, like, just kills his mother, like, instantly. And then later, like, during the big battle and everything, like, Lieutenant Shrieve just shoots one of these children. Which, yes, they're, like, campaigning against them. But, like, there's no, like, oh, we're going to knock you on your head and then cure you. No, he just, like, kills one of the kids. And then one of the children is battling with Lucky, and like it makes him realize like, oh, he's been taken over. So then all the kids like kill the Nazis. But then after they kill the Nazis, again, you would think in another book, okay, this is the time when they're all going to be deprogrammed, we're good. But no, because of the experiment, suddenly their bodies start changing into like a Grundle fly, like very Cronenberg, like their whole bodies explode into like this big mass, and then they just kind of like deflate into just like nothing but skin, and then the Creature Commandos just leave. So like all these young kids are just then like killed in this book, and it's like, oh my gosh, this is so like, you wouldn't, I'm sure you would not see that in another book around this time.
No, and certainly not years earlier in the 70s even. So yeah, you can see they're leaning into the loosening of the code here.
And a lot of it too is like, we have this ensemble here, but I was also really struck by like Shrieve, who's kind of our de facto leader, and he just like makes fun of the Creature Commandos like all the time. Like he's just constantly calling them freaks and like calling them names and like speaking down to them. It's like not like the kind of the Rick Flag Suicide Squad. It's like worse than that. I feel like it's like he's really just like talking down to them like the entire time, which I just thought, again, it's like, wow, this is the quote-unquote normal character, and he's like the worst one in terms of personality.
Yeah. So, all right, are you a fan? Before we move away from their origin issues, like reading this, are you a fan? Would you have wanted more?
I'm a fan in how weird and bizarre it gets. I think like they're great to read as a look into a very certain kind of comic writing and art from a specific time. I don't know if I would want to like just read them as an ongoing thing, but if you want to see like something that's like pretty depraved for comics and pretty bizarre, like then definitely like read a couple of issues and like get into it that way. What about you?
Well, editorial must have agreed with you because they have no other appearances for decades. So this is about it. So I like the concept. The stories here don't offer much, but I like the concept and I want to see what they do with it. And let's move into our next segment and find out if they do anything with it.
Okay, it's time to explore some multiversity.
I am your guide through these vast new realities. Follow me and ponder the question, what if?
And we are asking the question, what if classic horror movie monster tropes like Frankenstein and Dracula were turned into a Nazi fighting group of soldiers?
Yeah, so we're going to discuss pretty much all of their other appearances because most of them are on alternate Earths or no longer existing Earths. And so what's so unusual here is these characters have a couple dozen appearances total. And I'm remembering the only other time we discussed this was actually on a pretty recent episode with Agatha Harkness, this idea of like adapting this thing, this character, this world, part of the world that has very little source material. And this is definitely another example of that. And we'll talk more about that adaptation and the TV show in the third segment. But after that Weird War Tales run of stories, the concept is pretty much dead for over 20 years. And it's very unusual. And so then we get a few appearances in the DC Prime Earth looking to, you get a sense they're almost looking to bring them back and play with them. And then, of course, you get the New 52. So you kill the entire DC universe, and they are a core part of the New 52 reboot. But that title is canceled, and it really doesn't go anywhere in the rest of the universe. Of course, the New 52 Earth gets destroyed and rolled into what is currently our Prime Earth. And we have the current run clearly set up to be a tie-in to the TV show, but also in a slightly different world. So let's talk about these all together and go through the issues that we looked at and then talk through this whole segment of Multiversity and Creature Commandos.
So we've got Action Comics 872 from February 2009.
So that's from Geoff Johns and Pete Woods. The Creature Commandos are brought back via Brainiac, who has had them captive, had kidnapped them, and now they're freed. So reintroduction to them into the DC universe.
Next up, Justice League Generation Lost, number 16 from February 2011.
So this is like the post-Infinite Crisis dealing with Max Lord and all these other characters that were introduced by Judd Winnick and Fernando Dagnino. The Creature Commandos are back here now. They're fighting the JLI in some confusion. And we find out Max Lord is actually pretending to be Jake, pretending to be G.I. Robot. Of course, that's about to get cut off because it's later this year that the world ends.
Next up, Frankenstein, Agent of, in Alyssa Edwards' voice, Shade. Number 1, the New 52 reboot from November 2011.
Yeah, so at this point, months after the Generation Lost appearances, we get the total reboot of the DC universe. This is one of the number 1 titles, New 52, Jeff Lemire and Alberto Ponticelli. So in this, Frankenstein works for SHADE, which is the Superhuman Advanced Defense Executive, and the Creature Commandos show up, albeit in different forms and with a few new characters. From issue number 1, Creature Commandos show up, though this title gets canceled after issue number 16.
Executive. They really just couldn't come up with another word there.
It's
they really wanted that
acronym.
shade. They had to throw that in. And finally,
and the last thing we read for this segment.
Yes, DC Horror Presents Creature Commandos number 1 from December 2024. It's the first of 6 issues. Issue number 3 is on its way just after this episode is out.
Yes, and this is by horror actor, writer, creator David Dastmalchian and Jesus Hervas. It probably is an alternate Earth. It's not completely clear. The DC Horror Presents makes people think it is, but they didn't call it Black Label. And there are some characters. We meet Zatanna in issue 2, but it doesn't really tie into continuity, so it's unclear. The team is reformed with some variation, different origin, different way of pulling them together. So we have here 3 Action Comics and Justice League Generation Lost are somewhat linked, I'd say. We have here 3 different versions of an attempt to bring these teams back, and none of them stick. Well, we don't know if the David Dastmalchian will stick, but none of the previous ones stick. Where do you want to start? I guess let's start with the earliest one. So this attempt to sort of pull them back in via Brainiac and have them in the universe. For some reason, it never amounts to anything. But did you enjoy it?
Well, that one I think I like the. Yeah, I like the most because it literally is kind of a Captain America. I'm frozen in time. I'm now released into like this new world. So I like that the most, where it was very much like, okay, we're going to take those original characters and we're going to kind of re-release them now into like the current DC universe. So it wasn't really going back and like reinventing the wheel like I think you see in a lot of these other ones. It was like, okay, we've got a good concept. Let's just put these characters back into this world.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I just wish it stuck, but it didn't for whatever reason. And I should say, I should have included this in my history, but I didn't. Prior to this, in the year 2000, there's a Creature Commandos title, but it takes place in an alternate Earth, in an alternate future. The concept is there, but it's totally different characters with a few exceptions. It has no relationship to canon. So I ignored it and left it out. But I should add that that was like one sort of mysterious thing. And what made me think of it is in these titles, they actually they rename something after the writer of that series, Tim Truman. I think as an honor to him and the fact that he, I guess in 2000 had tried to relaunch this. But again, it's an alternate Earth, an alternate future, and doesn't have much of the DNA here. So let's move into the next major reboot. So we both enjoyed the attempt to bring them into DC canon. It fails, goes nowhere. Then we get Frankenstein, Agent of Shade. So New 52, starting from scratch in this new world. What do you think?
Well, It's odd that they focused, on the Frankenstein character, because in the original comics that we read, Frankenstein doesn't really even speak. He's kind of just
he doesn't speak at all. It's explained in the plot that they didn't give him vocal cords when they reassembled his body.
And from like Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein to Monster Squad as well, like the Frankenstein monster is always there as just kind of like the one that has kind of a conscience, and he doesn't ever speak. He's kind of always like a little bit more in the background. So it was an interesting choice to like put him at the forefront here, because it's not a character that I usually think of as being like, oh, who's the leader of the monster group? Oh, it's the Frankenstein monster.
Well, some of this, and I left this out because it really doesn't have anything to do with Creature Commandos, but I think the reason that they used him as the vehicle is because in 2006, there's a Grant Morrison series called Seven Soldiers Frankenstein that essentially relaunches this version of Frankenstein. Now, of course, that's in the DC New Earth, so it doesn't exist in the New 52. But I think that's part of why Frankenstein had a little more popularity, and there are things about his appearance that look a bit like the Grant Morrison reboot of this character. So I think that's why they focused on Frankenstein in the New 52 version, because they had this slightly rebooted version already in place from the Seven Soldiers, Grant Morrison, and then he actually makes an appearance in the Flashpoint world, too.
I wonder if you looked at when all of these reboots and the original and now the upcoming one came out, and if you looked in broader culture, if these monster characters ever came back. I don't know if around the time that these were being launched is when you had the Van Helsing movie, or even the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen movie or something like that. And then going back to the 80s with Fright Night and then Monster Squad. Now you have the new Wolfman coming out, a new Bride movie coming out. I wonder if you have I wonder if you have waves of these classic monsters resurging in popularity. And I wonder if there's a connection between when the Creature Commandos try to get rebooted to broader culture.
Though it feels like there's always a resurgence, a wave of these classic monsters going on, but not Creature Commandos. So
well, I guess it's also
but I think there's just so many more attempts. We've seen Universal Monsters were licensed like crazy in the 90s, and there were so many ads with them and stuff like that, but there wasn't a Creature Commandos attempt in the 90s, and then in the 2000s,
that's true.
I don't know,
but I think in general, it's interesting, you're saying why aren't the Creature Commandos reboots sticking? But in general, I think there's a difficulty with some of these characters in general sticking. When we had Universal trying to relaunch the Mummy series, and nobody wanted that, and I don't know.
Yeah,
I wonder
there
if there's
to be a quality control issue, and I actually say that's true with Creature Commandos. I mean, I read through some of that 2000 series, and more power to the people that love it, but it is so weird, and I don't like it, and it doesn't fit well. So, and I think that's probably the same with the Tom Cruise Mummy, having not seen it, but having read enough about it. I think there's a quality control issue with some of these reboots. I don't know why that is. I don't know. It's an interesting question why it doesn't.
Yeah, I
stick,
don't know.
but...
Do people think they can just like coast on the characters themselves, or maybe the people are too close to the characters?
On
they love them so much that they're forgetting to give
I don't think they love
plot.
them, though. I think that's part of the issue is you have, and I think this is true with some of these Creature Commandos, like even the retooled versions, which I'm not a huge fan of in Agent of Shade. I'm a little more into in the David Dastmalchian, and he's someone who I'm sure understands the essence of these characters and is a fan of them since he's such a wild horror fan in all sorts of ways. But I think that's probably part of the issue is people might like the characters, but I don't think they like really try to dig into what is at the core of these characters.
Yes.
And I think that's few and far between.
One thing I liked about the David Dastmalchian too is that they brought back the Shrieve character, because he was missing from a lot of those middle ones, and I think it benefits from having like the human, and also a human who's like quite like a jerk, which we also get in this new one as well. And I think it's good to have like these monster characters play off of this human character, and also like who is the true monster, that kind of idea as well. So I think it benefits from having that character as kind of a tentpole in which like these other characters can kind of revolve around. So I think they were very smart in that aspect.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's some good choices in this series. I think what's weird is it feels like a hybrid of so many of the things that came before. Like it has more of like the original series doesn't have so much of like the science aspect. The New 52 version does have that science shade, / shield aspect. And this tries to pull that in, and I'm not such a huge fan of that. So I'm not loving this series. I like Zatanna appearing in the second issue. You didn't read the second issue for this, but it's fun. I want it to be a part of the world, and it's not. They refer to the Justice League, but I don't think it's a part of the canonical Prime DC universe. I think it's a offshoot. So
I think a big thing for all of these that was lacking for me, including this new one, unfortunately, is I'm not a huge fan of most of the art that was done throughout this one. This one is very kind of like not very detailed art. In some of the other ones, we get very detailed art, but not of the kind of style I like. And if you go back to that original 1980s run from all of its, like I said, when it's the art is so much of what propels the story and makes it good, and you get that like creepy House of Mystery look. So part of me wants let's take what David Dastmalchian is doing with like these characters, but put in that like classic Bronze Age horror mystery look on top of it. I think that's what's needed to really sell this.
Yeah, I agree. So before we move into the most current iteration of this, I mean, it sounds like we're both sort of lukewarm on any of these comic book versions, and we've speculated a little bit about why a comic book version doesn't work. But here's what I'm wondering, like, can they coexist in just the core DC universe? Can there be a Justice League and a Creature Commandos? Because
yeah, totally.
No one has done that, and I don't know why. There was those attempts in 2009 and 2011, but
I liked in that first one in the Action Comics where they're awakened, and they're awakened by Superman, and they're like, wait, you're an alien? Like, I like that idea, like that they're monsters and yet they're weirded out that like they're talking to an alien. So I think like there totally can be them all kind of coexisting and then maybe playing off that. And I love for them to like interact, which I think maybe we'll get into the new series, like some of like the classic horror adjacent characters in like the Batman universe, which has a lot of like horror. There's a man bat, right? Like, and like I think they then worked on like that Velcro gets like man bat like serum, and that's what, so they were trying to put them together. So I totally think like we can see those characters all interact.
Yeah. All right, well, let's go to the latest version.
Yes, let's wrap up with our pondering possibilities.
Wrap up like the Mummy.
Will the future you describe be averted?
there was that random mummy character introduced later because they're like, he's the mysterious one. Like, he's not a science experiment. Like, he's a real mummy. But I was like, I don't no idea who this character is. I guess you need a mummy if you're going to have the Wolfman and Dracula. Like, you also have to have a mummy. But, Guido, what are we talking about for our pondering possibilities?
Well, this is where this is such a current episode for you and I, because this episode of our podcast is releasing the same week as the debut of the Creature Commandos series. So we have not seen the series because it has not come out yet when we're recording this. But this week, the first 2 episodes debut, and they're becoming weekly until January. Now, there are 7 episodes, all written by James Gunn. And what's interesting is, in addition to the series being R-rated, this is the official formal launch of the new DCU under James Gunn. This is the first part of the first chapter of his world, which he has titled Gods and Monsters. So this is the launch of it.
Is a Frankenstein
of course, comes from
reference.
Frankenstein. Yes. So we watched the trailer, which we don't usually do, but we watched the trailer and want to talk a little bit about what we hope for, what we think this is doing, why it's the launch of his new universe, et cetera, et cetera. So let's start with just impressions. We watched the trailer. What'd you think?
I was a little mixed on the trailer, I have to say. I mean, it's hard to tell because it's a trailer, but it's interesting because it's a different makeup of the group than any of the other iterations that we discussed here on the podcast. So there's some big ones like Vincent Velcro, the vampire character, is not there. Like, so that's like a pretty big one that's
we'll
gone.
Meet him, but he's not.
Yeah, the werewolf is gone. Yeah. Like, we have some other ones. It's actually
we
moved
have Weasel
a bit
instead of the werewolf.
Yes, a weird weasel. So it's actually moved a bit now. Maybe this was for legal reasons with Universal. I don't know. But they've moved away from like the classic Universal kind of monster concept, because like now it's like there's like, you know, a guy who's like more like Dr. Manhattan almost in a way. Like, so they've moved away from those and kind of embraced like new characters.
Yeah, it is basically Suicide Squad, but with some non-human characters, I think is what's happening here. That's what's so interesting to me about this being the start of this world, because I mean, James Gunn has done a lot of press recently with the question of like where Peacemaker fits into the world. Does it fit into the world or not? This is almost sort of seen as a sequel in some ways, because it is Viola Davis as Amanda Waller, but the point here is she can no longer use humans, so we can assume some of like Peacemaker and the Suicide Squad happened in this version of the universe, but not all of it necessarily happened, since this is the official start. So it's got to be interesting to see what it does. I mean, I don't think it's going to do a lot to break the world open. It's an animated R-rated show. Like, I don't think this is going to solve the riddle of what is the new DCU and what is the first chapter, Gods and Monsters.
Well, I've also seen a lot of press around that. It's like, but wait, isn't Harley Quinn also an animated R-rated DC show? Like, so like they were already doing that. It's like, not to like slight this, but it's like, no, I get that, but it's like
the difference is this is the sacred timeline, if you will. This is the prime canon. This is the thing like everyone is supposed to watch or consume in order to follow the thread of the prime canon, and it's an R-rated cartoon. So it is
Steve
a little
Agee
bit of an out of the box
is also here
thing.
from the Peacemaker TV show and the Suicide Squad. It's so Suicide Squad. It's interesting to me. You mean, we talked about that there's a lot of Suicide Squad DNA even in the Creature Commandos to kind of begin with, but it's very interesting like that his very first foray into DC was with the Suicide Squad, and now his like first foray as like the leader of DC is basically Suicide Squad Redux. I don't know if he wanted to like pay tribute or go back to his roots or something like that.
Well, of course, it's also similar to Guardians of the Galaxy. So clearly, some of these are just themes and structures that appeal to James Gunn for whatever reason. He likes teams of oddball characters coming together. He likes things being a little more adult. Of course, Guardians infamously has Star-Lord giving the finger blurred out in the trailer, which is like one of the earlier, even before they would allow a little bit of cursing examples in Disney. So he, I guess, likes something about that, and this is remarkably similar to that. I think it's the animated part that's interesting to me. I don't think we'll see like an animated MCU entry. I know What If is kind of technically part of the MCU, but let's move that aside. I think it's interesting to me that you're going to have animated characters coexisting with live action characters. Will David Harbour as whoever he's playing, probably a Frankenstein.
He's the Frankenstein monster.
But
yeah.
Will David Harbour? Yeah, we don't meet that in the trailer. So
okay. I looked at the.
Will he show up on screen at some point? Right? Like, will Frank Grillo's Rick Flag? I mean, we've already seen him, or he's a relative actually, right? I don't know.
He's Rick Flag Senior, so he is the father of the Joel Kinnaman character. Yeah. Who's Rick Flag
will
Jr.
we see him show up? Will we see I mean, I don't think we'll see Alan Tudyk, he's always a voice, but will we see Indira Varma, who's playing the bride? Like, we've seen Viola Davis, so it's just interesting to me that there's going to be this blend of live action and animation. How seamless is that going to be moving forward? I don't know.
And actually, on that note too, Alan Tudyk is also going to be voicing Clayface on this series. He also voices the Clayface on Harley Quinn as well. So, like, will those two Clayfaces be totally different? Is it gonna be the same Clayface? Like, maybe just, like, drawn differently, but the same personality, which is obviously very wacky and, like, lovable on Harley Quinn.
Yeah.
So I guess that will also say, like, how much the Harley Quinn show is, like, totally separate, or is it kind of gonna be a part of this world in some way?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, but it's going to be interesting. And then I think from this show we go into the Superman movie. So I think those are our first. I mean, I guess two entries.
Totally different.
Which it's so interesting. And again, it's not that I think that this series is going to be so much a part of the larger narrative, but it's just interesting that you know, like, he could have waited until the Superman movie and then released this series. So, like, why is this series coming out now? Again, I think it's going to stand alone pretty much, but I think it's going to do something to help us understand a little bit more about what we can come to expect in Superman and in the next Peacemaker and in the Green Lantern TV show and all the things coming down the pike.
Well, I mean, I'm still excited to watch it because I do love his writing. I love the Peacemaker show, and while it's of course he's not involved in, I do love the Harley Quinn show as well. So I think if they're able to put all those things together into one thing, I will definitely enjoy it. I'm just coming at it with a little bit of skepticism based on the past biography of Creature Commandos, and also just like by watching the trailer. But you know, who knows, trailers are made to be deceiving.
Yes. Well, when people are listening to this episode, we'll be watching the new episodes of the Creature Commandos, so we'll already have the answer to that question. Our future selves already know.
We can follow up on a future episode and say, what are our thoughts on the animated series then?
Well, we'll also post our thoughts online, so remember to follow us online. And for now, dear watchers, that is a wrap. Thank you for listening. I have been Franken Guido.
And I have been Rob.
Dracky Rob.
Yes.
The reading list is in the show notes.
And you can leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be back soon with another trip through the multiverse.
Keep pondering the possibilities.